When you hear the boss say, "Why are we even paying her?" That's about my mom. She's been working in an office her whole life, and stories like this aren't hype to me, they're personal. It's not just content, it's an attempt to show real feelings through mistakes that people make. Everything in this video is fictional, the names, companies, location, but the truth is in the essence, and maybe someone will recognize themselves.
Why are we paying her this much? That was the first thing out of Logan Pierce's mouth in a senior leadership meeting while I was still in the room. Not even subtle. Not even pretending it wasn't a hit job dressed as a budget review. The PowerPoint slide behind him had no names, just boxes and salary bands and one very bold red number under Finance Ops Architect. My number. He stared at it like it personally offended him, like it was my crime for having built something valuable enough to actually earn. I didn't react. I'd learned long ago that reacting gave people like Logan the performance they wanted. Instead, I glanced at the general counsel. She didn't blink, but her pen stopped moving. That was enough. Before we go further, if you're still listening, take a second to subscribe and like the video. It's a small thing, but it makes a huge difference to the team behind these stories. Most people don't, and it really helps us keep doing what we're doing. Now back to it. Denmore Capital wasn't a startup. It wasn't scrappy. It was a firm with decades of old money weight and new money volatility, hedge clients with billion-dollar moods, and a board made of sharks who wore tailored patience like a designer suit. I didn't come up through their world. I was recruited out of a university lab after a partner saw my paper on stochastic volatility clustering. Not exactly the resume that gets you invited to rooftop happy hours. But I built the models that kept them compliant, profitable, and just out of the SEC's crosshairs. My job title was Finance Operations Architect, but no one really knew what that meant until something went wrong and I was the one who could fix it. When the Tokyo desk ran hot on pre-market swaps and triggered an algorithmic panic, my fail-safes caught it. When a legacy partner in Chicago over-leveraged a risk corridor, my model rebalanced the exposure in under an hour. When we were audited in 2020, the lead examiner said, off the record, that our forecasting tools were unnervingly precise. But none of that mattered to Logan. Logan Pierce arrived with an MBA pedigree and a jawline that looked like it came with its own marketing department. He had a way of making every room feel like an interview. His voice had that smooth, performative calm that people mistake for leadership when they don't know any better. He didn't need to know what you did. He just needed to know how much you cost. And I cost too much. It started with him poking around HR, quiet requests, salary ranges, bonus records. Then it was model efficiency reviews and function alignment studies. I knew the playbook. He was trying to make me a line item on a reorg deck. But the part he missed? I wasn't just a legacy employee, I was a clause, a series of them actually, buried in the acquisition paperwork from when Denmore absorbed my old firm in 2017. I'd been part of the intellectual property bundle, sure, but I'd also negotiated my own terms. Clause 4.7D. I'll never forget it. It wasn't flashy. It didn't scream leverage, but it was ironclad. A buyout clause tied to involuntary termination or any role absorption without a 90-day offset window. It triggered liquidation of restricted equities, deferred comp, and, critically, derivative-linked bonuses aligned to firm-wide performance during my architecture term. Meaning, if they cut me loose wrong, they'd owe me nearly $19 million. Not theoretical, not up for debate, just sitting there in black and white, collecting interest. Logan didn't know that yet, but I could feel it coming. The way he kept using words like streamline and cost rationalization in the elevator, the way other VPs suddenly got very quiet around me, the way one director I'd mentored asked, very carefully, "So, you thinking about your next move?" I wasn't thinking about it. I was preparing for it, quietly, the way I always had, with numbers, with documentation, with every single thread tied to my departure already routed to legal, already time-stamped, already ready. Because when Logan finally made his move, I wasn't going to protest. I wasn't going to beg. I was just going to let him pull the wrong wire and watch the system collapse. The first sign was a spreadsheet, sent to my team by mistake. It came as part of a larger efficiency audit file package that someone in finance CC'd too widely. Buried in it, under a tab titled Comp, Value Review, was a column labeled Legacy High Cost Roles. My name was highlighted yellow. No formula, no notes, just a blunt number and a drop-down status next to it. Under review. That's when the music changed. Suddenly, meetings I used to be invited to were rescheduled. Reports I normally approved were rerouted. I asked the junior on my team, Kelsey, to forward me the data logs she'd been asked to pull. She hesitated before sending. The request had come directly from Logan's EA. They wanted 3 years of access logs for my forecasting tools, support ticket history, and user distribution data. In other words, they weren't asking how important my work was. They were trying to build a case that it wasn't. And that's always how they do it. Not with a confrontation, not with a conversation. With metadata. With contextless numbers and reorg jargon that sounds like leadership but smells like a pink slip. Realignment, capacity leveling, resource reallocation. I've been in this game long enough to know when someone's trying to erase you with Excel. Then I heard it directly from someone I trusted, a VP in risk who'd worked with me since the Denmore acquisition. He let it slip after a call. Logan's flagged you as overpaid for a legacy function. I didn't say that, just so we're clear. Overpaid. Legacy. As if the architecture holding half their compliance posture together was some dusty Rolodex. So I requested a meeting. Logan obliged. He always loved the theater of transparency, as long as he thought he held the script. His office was staged for performance. Mahogany desk, too clean, framed MBA degree angled just enough to catch your eye. He gestured like we were old friends catching up over coffee. "I'm glad you reached out," he said. "I think it's good we're being proactive." I let the silence settle before answering. "Is there a specific concern?" "Well," he began, leaning back like a man rehearsing empathy. "As we shift into a more agile model, some historical roles are being evaluated for redundancy. It's not personal." I waited. Nothing irritates a man like Logan more than a woman who doesn't flinch. He tried again. "The firm's just outgrown the old cost structure. Things evolve. We're streamlining, optimization, alignment, you know the language." I nodded. "Sure, just make sure legal signs off." That made him pause. Just for a second. Like he wasn't expecting pushback, and certainly not that kind of pushback. He waved it off, casual. "They will. This is all pretty standard." Standard? He had no idea. I'd spent the better part of the last 6 years buried in models and equity structures, mine included. I knew the clause he hadn't read, the one that didn't care about his MBA buzzwords or his friendly HR walkout scripts, the one that turned his little cost-saving crusade into a multi-million-dollar problem the second he made it official. Clause 4.7d. Triggered by any termination, voluntary or involuntary, without offset clearance or explicit buyout authorization. Not just severance, not just deferred comp. It tied into 3 tranches of equity, 2 derivative-linked bonuses, and an auto-conversion clause from the acquisition agreement. It was complex on purpose. I'd written half of it myself. And now the clock was ticking. Because Logan thought he was trimming fat. He was cutting a fuse. It was a Wednesday, rain tapping the windows like a clock ticking down. The monthly leadership roundtable always had the same energy, polite warfare in designer clothing, bagels no one ate, coffee everyone refilled as if caffeine would soften the blow of whatever new pivot was about to be inflicted. Logan walked in 5 minutes late, laptop under his arm, smiling like a man who just got away with something. He didn't waste time. "Thanks, everyone. Let's jump right in," he said, clicking his laptop to the projector. Slide 1, 2026 Org Structure Proposal, Analytics Division. Clean, polished, no names, just boxes. "We've been working on a leaner structure to support strategic efficiency," he continued. "Based on internal assessments and usage metrics, we're streamlining redundant functions and redistributing high overlap roles." Slide 2 hit harder. "Role absorptions, estimated annual savings." And then he said it. "Some roles will be absorbed, including Finance Ops Architect. Savings, $328K per year." He said it like he was reading the weather. Then he looked straight at me. "No offense, of course." The room went still. People don't gasp in boardrooms. They go quiet. They avoid eye contact. They reach for their phones like maybe they just remembered something urgent, but they didn't. They just don't want to watch the fallout. I didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't give him the satisfaction of asking questions he wouldn't answer. Instead, I stood up, calmly, smoothly, reached into my bag and pulled out a sealed envelope. I walked to the table and set it directly in front of Logan. Not tossed, not slammed, placed. My resignation, effective immediately. A few heartbeats passed. Then I removed my security badge and set it gently on top of the envelope. The general counsel's head snapped up. She hadn't been briefed. Her pen stopped moving mid-sentence. Her lips parted slightly, then pressed into a pale line. Logan blinked. Once. Then again. Like the file he'd rehearsed didn't include this scene. Like the spreadsheet he'd weaponized hadn't prepared him for a target who walked away before being pushed. The CFO made a noise, like he wanted to interrupt but didn't know how. And the COO? He sat very still, watching me with a look I hadn't seen in years. Not confusion, not anger. Recognition. Because the COO had been part of the acquisition back in 2017. He'd signed the agreement. He'd seen the clause. He just realized Logan hadn't. No one said a word. I picked up my bag, walked to the door, paused long enough to let the moment land, then stepped out and let it close behind me. No dramatic speech, no cold smile, just the sound of silence rearranging itself behind me. That's the thing about force. When it's silent, people feel it more. By the time I got to the elevator, my inbox had 3 unread emails. One from HR, time-stamped during the meeting, one from legal, flagged urgent, and one from my attorney. It's begun. Logan thought he'd trimmed a number. What he'd done was trigger a chain reaction that had been sleeping in a file cabinet for 8 years, waiting for someone arrogant enough to ignore the fine print. And now it was awake. By 2:17 p.m., the panic had a scent. Stale coffee, overheating laptops, and a faint sour fear seeping into the carpet. I wasn't there to see it, but I'd been inside the system long enough to know how it would unfold. The leadership team probably expected a quiet off-boarding, some perfunctory IT alerts, maybe a farewell email from HR with a "thank you for your service" subject line. What they got instead was a legal escalation notice marked urgent and a cascade of calendar invites flagged mandatory general counsel review. See, my resignation hadn't been a resignation at all, not in the way they assumed. It had been a trigger, a legal switch disguised as a routine envelope. Clause 4.7d, buried in the 2017 acquisition documentation, right after the indemnity provisions and before the non-compete language. You had to read past the 4th appendix and into the equity annex to find it. Most people didn't. Logan definitely hadn't. But I had. Because I didn't just sign it, I wrote it, alongside Denmore's M&A counsel during a time when they were still hungry to close and still convinced I was essential. The clause was surgical in its wording. Termination, voluntary or involuntary, of the finance operations architect, designated lead architect, without 90-day offset notice or pre-approved equity buyout authorization, shall trigger a pro rata liquidation clause tied to restricted equities and derivative alignment bonuses earned during the contract term. Translation: cut me loose without process or payout, and every equity grant, every deferred comp vehicle, every performance bonus derivative I'd ever touched since 2017 becomes liquidated at full market adjusted value, with penalty interest. And the kicker? It was all tied to indexed performance ratios that had climbed dramatically thanks to my models. Total exposure, $18.9 million. Legal saw it first. The general counsel's associate flagged the clause in the archive scan, highlighted in red, with a 3-word comment attached. Is this real? It was. Logan, still playing dress-up in his corner office, called it absurd, said I was gaming the system. But gaming implies manipulation. This wasn't a trick. It was structure. He triggered a mechanism designed to protect the people who built the engine he never learned to drive. Legal didn't care about his feelings. They cared about exposure, and exposure was astronomical. The CFO called the CEO. I imagine that conversation began with an inhale through the nose, the way people do when they're about to ruin someone's day without raising their voice. The CEO didn't know the details either. He hadn't touched the acquisition paperwork in years. Logan had assured him this was routine restructuring, just one name on a cost sheet. Just one old role we'd evolved beyond. Except now that one name came with a legally binding invoice large enough to nuke the Q2 bonus pool and trigger multiple downstream partner reviews. By late afternoon, the GC was demanding a legacy clause audit. Logan, cornered and still smug, reportedly asked, "Can't we just call her? Work something out." But it wasn't about me anymore. It was about the clause. And the clause didn't negotiate. It executed. What they didn't understand, what Logan never understood, was that I'd never been trying to keep a seat at their table. I just made sure they'd pay full price when they thought they could throw mine away. And now they were starting to realize what that price really was. They say numbers don't lie, but they also don't negotiate. And Logan? He still thought this was a PR problem, that if he just stared hard enough at a spreadsheet, he could blink the liability into something more palatable. He was wrong. By Thursday morning, he had finance in a conference room running recalculations on the clause like they were solving a riddle instead of reading a contract. He kept asking the same question, "What's the real number?" And the head of finance kept giving the same quiet answer, "That is the real number." Because Clause 47D didn't care what Logan thought was reasonable. It didn't tether itself to my base salary, which had been modest by executive standards. It referenced adjusted trailing comp, a phrase Logan hadn't understood and now couldn't ignore. Adjusted trailing comp meant the average of total compensation over 5 years, not just base. It included performance bonuses, equity grants, index-linked awards, and, most critically, the derivative alignment pool. That pool was a special construct built into our firm's compensation system, designed to track long-term model accuracy against fund performance. And for 7 years straight, my models had overperformed, which meant every percentage point I'd helped earn was now part of what they owed. Add in early liquidation penalties, interest escalators, and clause-triggered acceleration multipliers, and the 18.9 moderate wasn't a ceiling. It was a floor. Finance presented the model in silence. No one tried to defend it. No one tried to soften it, because there was nothing left to soften. The numbers weren't inflated. They were audited, verified, and embedded in systems that Logan hadn't even realized I helped design. Still, he tried to reframe it. Could we argue she left voluntarily? Legal said no. The clause didn't hinge on intent. It hinged on sequence. And Logan had put my title on a slide, in a public forum, as absorbed. That was enough. He hadn't fired me, but he'd rendered my role obsolete, without clearance. They'd called it a cost-saving measure. Now they were watching the cost multiply by the hour. And just as legal began diagramming downstream implications, the second ripple hit. The partners. See, Denmore wasn't a traditional pyramid firm. It was stitched together by fund managers, each with their own performance incentives and risk metrics. And a lot of those were built using models I'd personally created. Models they trusted. Ones calibrated not just for technical accuracy, but for regulatory survival, carry terms, volatility caps, hedging corridors, all built with my fingerprints. When I vanished overnight, they noticed. The first message came from the Chicago desk. Simple. To the point. If Claire's no longer active, we'll need to reevaluate the assumptions tied to our trailing comp structure. Her models were explicitly referenced in our term sheet. Logan didn't reply. The second came from a hedge lead in San Francisco. Can someone explain whether the ops architect has been replaced or duplicated? We're flagging risk alignment discrepancies in last week's forecasts. By the third message, a partner attached their original modeling appendix and circled a line in bold, structured with reference to finance ops architect model parameters. Changes require notification and signed risk reevaluation. Translation? Denmore couldn't just delete me from the equation. Not legally, not contractually, not structurally, but Logan had already done it, on a slide, in front of the entire leadership team. And now, Now the foundation was cracking. Quietly, systematically, he'd yanked the keystone, assuming the rest of the structure would hold. It wouldn't. It was day 2 when someone finally read the clause in full, not just skimmed it. Read it, line by line, and somewhere around the phrase, triggered pro rata acceleration with no cure period, the room shifted from damage control to triage. Clause 4.7d didn't just lay out the cost, it laid out the clock. 14 business days. That's what they had from the moment I placed the envelope on the table. Not to apologize, not to walk it back, to pay in full, or face cascading default triggers across every linked agreement that used my models as a foundational input. That meant quant desks. That meant carry term structures. That meant certain regulatory reporting assumptions. Denmore had built their compliance profile on what I'd designed. Now they had a deadline to either recognize that or suffer the consequences of pretending it never mattered. The clause wasn't flexible. It wasn't subject to internal interpretation. It was a self-executing mechanism. And the minute the GC confirmed that, Logan's voice stopped carrying weight in the room. Completely. He kept trying anyway. "We still have time," he insisted. "Let's not panic. Let's get creative." But this wasn't a pitch deck or a product launch. There was no narrative to spin. Just a cold timer, ticking quietly behind every partner call and every spreadsheet recalculation. Day 3, a hedge partner out of Greenwich requested a meeting with legal and the CFO. The email subject line was simple: continuity assurance. Inside the thread, he'd included a question. If Claire's departure is finalized, who assumes responsibility for the derivative alignment review on Q3 performance? There was no good answer. Day 4, the Asia desk halted all automated model pushes pending internal recalibration. Their VP didn't wait for the permission. He'd been on the receiving end of an SEC letter before, and he wasn't about to bet his license on a half-transitioned architecture. Day 5, a long-standing client froze a $48 million renewal. No anger, no warning, just a brief message to sales: "We'll revisit after operational alignment is confirmed." By the end of that day, the buyout number had ballooned, penalty interest kicking in, equity pricing recalibrated to live market values, and option floors tripping upward thanks to the firm's own trailing comp trends. Every hour they waited made it worse. And the worst part? They were the ones feeding the math, because the models still worked, still calculated, still harvested and indexed in real time. I didn't have to do a thing. The machine I built was calculating the cost of my absence without me touching a key. And then came day 6. I got a message on LinkedIn. It was short, from a Denmore board member I'd spoken to maybe twice in my life. "Is this retrievable?" No name, no context, just that. I didn't reply. I forwarded it to my attorney and closed the app. That's the thing about leverage. If you use it right, you never have to raise your voice. You just let the silence deepen until the other side can't breathe in it anymore. Logan thought he was conducting a reorg. He thought he was reshaping a structure that had outlived its purpose, but all he did was start a countdown. And now everyone in the building could hear the clock. The offer sheet from Rothmore was 6 pages, crisp, clear, and without fluff. No corporate theater, no HR sanitized mission statements. Just numbers, responsibilities, and one clean title at the top: Partner, Infrastructure, and Risk. I read it once, then again, then signed it without hesitation. They didn't ask for a pitch. They didn't ask me to prove anything. They already knew. Rothmore had quietly watched the Denmore unraveling from the sidelines, like veteran firefighters watching a rookie light a controlled burn on dry brush. The moment Logan pulled my name off that org chart, they moved. 2 days later, their managing director flew to New York. We met in a private conference room at the Carlyle. No posturing, no wine list, just him, a leather folder, and one sentence: "We know what you built. Let's build something better." Rothmore wasn't a bank. It wasn't a fund. It was the thing those firms called when they needed to know where the real cracks were. Scenario modeling, DOJ simulations, risk resilience frameworks that lived in regulatory footnotes and case law. That kind of work doesn't get you magazine profiles, but it gets you power. And that's what they offered me. Not visibility, control. Meanwhile, back at Denmore, the walls were whispering. The same way I'd once quietly built their risk backbone, my departure circulated with eerie efficiency. No press release, no LinkedIn update, just quiet meetings being rescheduled, desk heads asking new questions, a thread of tension tightening around Logan's name. He tried calling me once. I didn't answer. Then he sent an email, just 3 words. "Can we chat?" I didn't reply. My attorney did. "Please direct all communication to counsel." No signature, no smiley, just a steel wall where the door used to be. That was the last time Logan attempted contact directly. Because at that point, it was no longer between him and me. It was between Denmore and the clause. Between hubris and contract. The next board meeting was not what he'd planned. Legal walked in with the updated exposure report. Finance with the updated liquidity model. The number had stabilized. High, but predictable. Still, paying it outright would gut the bonus pool for Q2 and trigger optics issues with key funders. They debated for hours behind closed doors. Eventually, they voted to authorize partial payment. It was a desperate middle ground. Enough to slow the timer, not enough to settle it. The rest would need to be negotiated with my counsel, who had already advised that anything short of full execution would keep the default clause in play. But Denmore didn't have leverage anymore. They had delay. And delay was still debt. I watched it all from my new office in Boston. Glass walls, quiet view, a single framed photo on the shelf. My original 2017 contract. The page with clause 4.7D highlighted. A reminder that the best defenses are the ones no one sees until it's too late. Logan thought he'd sidelined me. He didn't realize I'd already changed the game, and left his piece off the board. The boardroom at Denmore wasn't built for panic. It was built for power. Frosted glass, reclaimed wood, the kind of architectural smugness that says, "We never make mistakes here." But that morning, it smelled like one. Legal entered first. 2 in-house attorneys and external counsel from a firm that charges $2,000 an hour just to think. No small talk. No coffees in hand. Just binders and a clicker. The screen was already lowered and the projector glowed with corporate doom. Slide 1. Clause 4.7D. Triggered. The room shifted. Not violently, just the kind of stillness that happens before someone either confesses or combusts. Slide 2. Estimated liability 18.9 net. This time, it landed. The CFO coughed quietly, like maybe he could clear the number out of the air. A managing partner from Chicago leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. The head of investor relations looked like she might actually cry, and then came slide 3. Client churn risk. 3 major partners. Those weren't just clients. They were pillars. Carry-heavy, long-standing, deeply integrated. Clients whose agreements contained direct references to my models. Clients who were now asking legal questions Denmore didn't want to answer. The CEO, Michael Vance, 2-time turnaround specialist, boardroom silverback, finally broke the silence. He turned to Logan, calm as thunderclouds gathering. "You didn't review the legacy comp structure?" Logan opened his mouth, then closed it, then tried again. It was buried. And that's when the general counsel interrupted him. Flat, cold, final. "She warned you." No raised voice, no gloating, just a scalpel slicing through whatever narrative Logan thought he still had. You could hear the oxygen shift in the room. Because I had warned him. Not with a threat. Not with a speech. Just 6 words. "Make sure legal signs off." He didn't. And now the clause was live. The payout was due, and legal had already advised that failure to pay would trigger compounding defaults in the firm's risk disclosures. And then, like divine timing written in binary, a soft chime echoed from the wall monitor. An email. Real time. The subject line was just 1 word. Transfer. It was from Rothmore Strategies. The body. Effective immediately, Rothmore will assume audit modeling responsibilities for the following accounts previously held by Denmore Capital. And then the list. 4 names. Including one that had been with Denmore since before I joined. Including one that brought in a full 18% of quarterly fee revenue. The screen went dim. No one moved. Logan looked like he'd been gutted quietly. Not stabbed. Just hollowed. The CEO didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The power had shifted. Not in theory. In reality. In revenue. The future wasn't sitting in that room anymore. It was already across town, on the 32nd floor of a firm Logan hadn't even thought to worry about. Mine. It's strange how loudly silence can echo. Rothmore's announcement wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Just a single clean line added to the partner page beneath a navy banner. Claire Wren, partner, infrastructure, and risk. No photo, no spotlight article, no breathless LinkedIn post about next chapters or incredible journeys. Just a name, and the role that had become the axis of two firms' futures. The work spoke for itself. Our first project involved recalibrating a hedge client's audit scenario pipeline, one that had previously depended on Denmore's legacy models. I didn't replace the models. I rewrote them from the ground up. In 2 weeks, Rothmore's compliance team passed a stress test that Denmore had failed 3 times in a row. I didn't call anyone, didn't send any messages, just watched the results land. Signed, time-stamped, court-ready, the kind of reports regulators don't question, the kind of performance that doesn't raise voices, it raises retainers. Back at Denmore, the unraveling was quieter now, not the loud kind of collapse, but the slow kind, the kind that shows up as empty chairs and shortened call lists. Logan was reassigned to a strategic initiatives role, the corporate purgatory where reputations go to suffocate. He didn't send a farewell memo. The CEO issued a firm-wide statement 2 days later, thinly veiled, filled with phrases like legacy awareness, operational thoroughness, and contractual clarity moving forward. Everyone knew what it meant. They'd built a system on invisible pillars. Then they tried to yank one out without asking how it held. And when it all cracked, they realized too late. I'd left the instructions behind. Just not with them. I never responded to the noise. Not the analysts speculating about the payout. Not the trade publications trying to spin a headline. Not the former colleagues reaching out with cautiously worded texts. I didn't need to speak. The spreadsheets spoke. The clauses spoke. The partner contracts that now listed Rothmore instead of Denmore, they spoke volumes. And me? I went to work. Not for applause, not for revenge, for precision. Because Logan once looked at my comp sheet and saw a number that offended him. Now, if he ever wants to know how much I'm worth, he'll have to call Rothmore. And they don't take walk-ins.